Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Pratt. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programming here at the Erie Canal Museum. Thank you very much for joining us today. The impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, politically, and artistically. Today, we are pleased to be hosting Ashley Hopkins Benton and Karen Quinn from the New York State Museum to discuss that artistic aspect of the canal and explore the many ways in which the Erie Canal shaped art. But first, some commercials. Our next lunchtime lecture is on October 19th and will be both virtual and in person. The town of Sullivan historian and a 30-year employee of the Marcellus Casket Company right here in Syracuse, Mike Beardsley, will examine a unique artistic medium, the American casket, in his talk, Underground Novelties, a humorous history of the American casket. Perfect for October. Additionally, today is the end of this year's popular BBB series with a special walking tour in Baldwinsville. Stop by the Baldwin Canal Park at 6 p.m. And with the price of admission, you'll get both a great historic walking tour of that canal town and a beer at WT Brews included in the price of admission. October is going to be a busy month for us all month with a number of exciting programs, including a talk on women in the life of Frederick Douglass, a virtual roundtable with the Delaware and Lehigh Canals, the Ohio and Erie Canal, and our Erie Canal behind the scenes spooktacular, exploring the hidden history of this very building. Ooh. Learn more about all those by following us on social media, subscribing to our e-newsletter, and visiting the events tab on our website. But now on to today's event. Karen E. Quinn is Senior Historian and Curator, Art and Culture at the New York State Museum. Currently, she is researching and building the collection of art related to New York State, including decorative arts, paintings, works on paper, architecture, photography, popular culture, literature, and music, and interpreting them for the museum visitor. In addition, she is working with colleagues to develop interdisciplinary exhibitions, public programs, and publications that put works of art into their historical and cultural context. Exhibitions have included Art of the Erie Canal, we'll learn more about today, the Historic Woodstock Art Colony, Arthur A. Anderson Collection, saw that one was great, Tonalism, Pathway from the Hudson River School to Modernism, and Captured, recent photography acquisitions. She has a BA Honors in Art History from McGill University and an MA in Art History from the University of Pennsylvania. Ashley Hopkins Benton is a senior historian and curator of social history at the New York State Museum, where her research and collections work focuses on women's history, LGBTQ+ history, immigration, sculpture, toys, glass, and ceramics. Her publications include Enterprising Waters, The History and Art of New York's Erie Canal, available in our gift shop. Along with Brad Utter and Karen. Votes for Women, Celebrating New York's Suffrage Centennial, and Breathing Life into Stone, the sculpture of Henry DeSpirito. She holds an MA in Museum Studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program and a BA in Art Education and Studio Art from SUNY Potsdam. So without further ado, here they are.
Thank you very much, Derek. I want to start with this fabulous image that was our poster child for the Art of the Erie Canal, which was an exhibition that we mounted to be the companion to Enterprising Waters, which was mostly Brad Utter's. Well, it was a lot of people, but Brad Utter's brainchild. I'll give him credit. And the Enterprising Waters exhibition was up from September of 2017 through July of 2022. And then Art of the Erie Canal, largely because the objects were of a different nature and couldn't stay out as long, was up from April of 2018 to September of 2018. This might be a familiar view to many of you in Syracuse. This is Clinton Square. Syracuse, New York by Johann Mengel's Culver House, also more popularly perhaps called Syracuse by Moonlight. And it certainly is a wonderful place to start in terms of both what the Erie Canal represents to artists, as well as the background in terms of the industry and the development and the engineering of the canal. This is a very romantic, with the capital R, point of view, with the moonlight and the building. It's hauntingly beautiful. And I think that gives you a little bit of the sense of what many of the artists that I'm going to show you really looked at as far as the Erie Canal is concerned. Amongst the earliest artists who depicted the canal was actually a draftsman hired by the engineers to document some of what was going on, James Yates. And I'm showing you 1823 watercolors, which are quite rare and quite amazing considering the canal didn't open for 2 more years. And the one on the left is the Aqueduct Bridge at Little Falls, and the other is the Aqueduct Bridge at Rochester. And certainly these celebrate the engineering feats of the canal in terms of being the aqueducts, but also sets the tone for what artists will find so interesting about the canal itself. And one of course, the most important things about the canal is that it allowed visitors to travel from east to west. And that included artists, which is really important considering the number of artists who would travel from New York City up to Albany, all the way to Buffalo. And it made it much easier for them to discover the landscape of New York State, which had been quite difficult in terms of access. And certainly many of the artists that you see in this exhibition traveled the length of the Erie Canal, and we'll see some of them along the way. This is another James Yates on the left, the entrance of the canal into the Hudson at Albany, taken in 1823. And then on the right, just to give you a flavor of the popularity of canal imagery depicted by some of these artists that were made into all sorts of things. And Ashley will be discussing some of that, but just to show you one Staffordshire plate. And this is a kind of souvenir that was made very popular by the artistic imagery of the canal. And certainly souvenirs are something we can all identify with as we travel. Maybe not a Staffordshire plate, but certainly we collect postcards and knickknacks and so forth, T-shirts these days, as we travel either abroad or across country. And in this instance, I'm comparing 2 images of Albany, and I think this really captures the way that artists would look at the landscape around the Erie Canal. On the left is Edwin Whitefield's lithograph view of Albany from the east from 1845, and certainly the physical impact of the canal on places like Albany and all the cities along the canal to Buffalo, Syracuse included, of course, was that they grew and it brought populations and to these places. And on the left, you can see the growth of Albany itself. And on the right is DeWitt Clinton Boutelle, a painter who's not particularly well known, but is named after DeWitt Clinton, first of all, which is quite interesting at that time. And this is his view from Mount Ida, also looking across, and that's from 1845 too. So 2 different views from 1845. Boutelle is certainly fitting nicely into the tradition of what we call the Hudson River School artists who, for really because of the Hudson River area, started in that area, although their impact stretched all the way across New York and then further west, but also to the east into places like the White Mountains and Maine as well. And here you have this view framed by the trees with the tiny little figures resting as they climb up to get the fabulous view. But the emphasis is certainly on nature and not on the growth of a city in this. And the back and forth is something we will see over and over again. Some artists want to show the growth and the beauty of the architecture. Others battle against that and find it sometimes troubling. They will maybe put a train in their painting and have that impact of clear cutting and all that as a sort of ecological footnote to becoming more important, not as a footnote, but certainly as a thought, as a philosophy in their work. And here we have another wonderful comparison. Artist Jay Jackson, this is the upper falls of the Genesee River. And then a Thomas Cole, which was not in our exhibition, but is illustrated in the book of Genesee Scenery from 1847, the Jacksons from 1858. Two paintings where you can see again, the Cole, who is considered the father of the Hudson River School. And just as a footnote, it wasn't called the Hudson River School until the 1870s and 80s. And then it was kind of used as a sort of poo-poo term that, oh, those guys, like Impressionism, those guys of the Hudson River School, something that photographer Edward Weston accused Ansel Adams of as the Nature Grand School. But here you have Cole giving us a view up and across the river, the waterfalls, and waterfalls became, of course, a very popular topic for artists because it's celebrating the natural beauty of the American landscape. And keep in mind that artists were also striving to find reasons to make American subjects prominent. We didn't have the same history as Europe had, so we couldn't celebrate the great ruins throughout Europe and the Middle East. So landscape became a very important vehicle for that. And oftentimes landscapes are tinged with historical references. Cole, for instance, would paint in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and he would paint Mount Chippewa, and Mount Chippewa is associated with Native American folklore. So there's a lot of that going on. But he creates a vertical landscape, which is quite atypical, and a vertical landscape really emphasizes the waterfalls. Here, Jackson emphasizes the horizontal spread of the waterfall, and he also includes the growth of the buildings in the background. So two slightly or very different approaches to landscape. And this is another similar comparison with two watercolors by William Rickerby Miller, View of Little Falls from 1852, and then Little Falls, and then William Bartlett, View on the Erie Canal near Little Falls on the bottom. The Little Falls in the upper left, lovely bucolic view that shows the village in the distance, the canal, travelers along the canal, the horse, the mule along the canal driving the boat along as well. And then kind of the opposite, which is no evidence of the hand of man, except the canal, but the emphasis on the landscape itself and the unique qualities of that landscape. And then in the Bartlett, you get a little bit of both. You get the huge cliffs on either side, and then you have travelers along the canal as well. So the sort of back and forth between the settling and the growth of settlement in the landscape, as opposed to sort of tunnel visioning yourself away from that. And really the way they get there is because of the settlement of the landscape. And this was actually in the enterprising waters side of the exhibition. It's a William Wall, it's New York and the Erie Canal from 1862. But interestingly enough, in this instance, the railroad has already been gone through this part of the canal area. The canal is here, river, but Wall avoids including the railroad in this image. So you have very much many of these artists, they edit their views. And if you look at their sketchbooks, oftentimes their sketchbooks bear no resemblance to the final product. They really, the final product is a studio product, not always painted outside or what is called en plein air. And then at the terminus of the canal, this of course is Niagara Falls, which could and has been exhibitions all on its own in terms of art as well as art and culture in general. This is one of the most famous Niagara Falls views, painted by Frederick Church in 1857. And it's quite large. It's 40 by 90 and a half inches, which is to help you get right into that view and feel like you are there. The only problem is there's literally no place to stand. You are in the water when you are looking at this point of view. This became one of the most popular views of Niagara's. Ironically enough, it's from the Canadian side, not the American Falls, but it did become very popular and certainly indicates how important travel across the state was. There's just a little hint of some buildings in the distance, but certainly the emphasis is on the falls themselves. And before I ever went to Niagara Falls, I certainly studied plenty of art history and such. And I always thought that these were kind of hokey images until you get there. And when you get there, it's absolutely every bit as breathtaking as you like. And it really is awe-inspiring, that sense of the sublime, which was another capital R romantic philosophy or sensation. And you see the hint of even the rainbow, you think, oh, that rainbow, not really there. Oh, yes, when you're there, you see rainbows all the time. And it really is an impactful and awe-inspiring place. It really has, especially if you can get away from the crowds. And just to show you, these three were not in the exhibition either. Three more paintings with three slightly different points of view. And in the George Innes here, you can see plenty of buildings in the distance. So he's not really, he is focusing on the falls. And this is also a large painting. This is Samuel F.B. Morse, the inventor of the telegraph. And this is quite interesting in that the figures include Native Americans as well as tourists. And the size of the figures, unlike the church painting, the size of the figures really helps to establish a sense of scale and emphasize that sort of awe-inspiring aspect of the falls. And then this is Niagara Falls by Jasper Proxy from the foot of Goat Island. And that also, you're down low, looking up high, like many of the Thomas Wolfe pictures. That gives you a sense of the importance in terms of really a natural landmark that was made popular during the 19th century. In the exhibition were included a series of George Barker photographs. On the left is Niagara Falls Cave of the Winds from about 1888. And then on the right is one of his stereographs. And he had a stereograph studio in Niagara where you could purchase stereograph views. And if you don't know what a stereograph is, this is how, when I was growing up, we had a Viewmaster, and you put a disc in, and it would make it look like it was 3D. And that's if you put into the viewer for a stereograph, it'll make the image look like it's three-dimensional. And certainly here you have a little place to stand, and there you almost can't imagine standing, at least me, fear of heights, standing on that bridge with the falls crashing over you. And again, like Cole, he makes it a vertical image, which emphasizes that height of the falls. And here you would bring these home, of course, and use them as stereographs. People would have stereograph viewers in their parlors and so forth. So for awesome and grandeur, awesome in the proper use of that term, awe-inspiring and grandeur, certainly the canal helped American artists move across the state and see the wonders of the American landscape. Some of them fraught with the issues of settlement in industry and impact on the landscape. As we head into the 20th century, of course, the canal itself goes into some decline and moves. And so when it moves, some of the places that were along the canal also start to deteriorate. Much of that is still visible today. Some of it happily has changed. On the left is Franny Hotchkiss. This is in this institution's collection, and it's a view on the canal near Syracuse, mid-20th century. We know absolutely nothing about Franny Hotchkiss. This is the only painting that's come to light by her, so it's a wonderful mystery. If anybody wants to do some research, see who she was and what connection she has. But she kind of emphasizes the sort of dilapidation of the buildings along the canal, but it's still a very lush and beautiful landscape. And I think that's something for which we can be certainly grateful for. And the other is John W. Taylor, the Erie Canal at Canastota. And this is the old canal bed. So it's been moved, and we see the buildings along the canal, kids fishing in the water now, a very different kind of canal than it would have been at its heyday. Also in the 20th century, especially with the rise of the WPA and the Federal Works of Art programming, we have artists returning to subjects from American history to be used often as commissions or entrances to gain commissions for public buildings, many of which were post offices and libraries and what have you. Fortunately, a lot of which still survive because of largely benign neglect. This kind of imagery fell out of favor, but the murals, when they were put in place, this one is by Henry Schnackenberg, which is the departure of a packet boat on the Erie Canal from 1939, and this was the sketch, if you will, oil sketch for the finished mural that's at the Amsterdam post office. So it's Schnackenberg was very well known as an illustrator, and this is a way that the artist would make money, but it is nonetheless a nostalgic view of the canal, something that was obviously in the past, and artists beginning as early as the late 19th century with someone like E.L. Henry started to do this kind of looking at the American past as very nostalgic and in many cases glossed over in many cases. And finally, this Jeffrey Biggs kind of ends on a note of a little bit more optimism, looking forward to the future. This is Landscape with Barges from around 1950. He too was an illustrator for magazines like Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post. And this includes the beechnut plant here, and he lived in Palatine Bridge, which is in the foreground. Beechnut was, of course, one of the big industries along the canal at Canajoharie, sadly moved.
What's its name?
This is Biggs. And this is a wonderfully bright and colorful, and it's definitely full of optimism. And you see the hustle and the bustle, and it's certainly something to look forward to with optimism that we see as we head into the 21st century with the art of the Erie Canal.
So Karen talked a little bit about the two exhibitions that we had at the New York State Museum, Enterprising Waters and Art of the Erie Canal. And I want to mention that Enterprising Waters was the one that we first started working on. And when we first started years before it began, I was actually the collections technician working on that, trying to find artifacts that told the historical stories that we were looking for. And we very quickly found out you have too much art, you have to cut it back, you have to cut it back. So that's how we came up with the art exhibit. And what I want to share with you today is some of the themes that appeared in the art with artworks from both exhibitions and look at those a little further. So, of course, the Erie Canal led to a huge expansion of industry and manufacturing, and it was artists of all types that helped broadcast this story. And of course, Karen talked about the ways that artists made decisions. They used creative license sometimes to avoid industry, but in other cases, some artists sought it out actively. And in some cases, the products that we see being produced along the canal were actually works of art or decorative arts in their own respects. So I'm going to talk about those different layers of industry. Here we have two more examples of transfer printed earthenware. This was a major medium for dissemination of Erie Canal images. And I think they're really interesting. Even in the credit lines here, you can see all of the different layers of artists and artisans who were involved in producing these works. So generally, there's an original sketch and then a print, and then it becomes put on a piece of ceramic. So lots of different layers, and international, of course. These ceramics were produced in England. But I also think these two examples, which both show the Erie Canal terminus at Buffalo, are interesting because they are not shying away from industry. They're showing industrial areas and the nitty-gritty of working on the canal and how it impacted industry. And then we have a much later scene of industry by Beatrice Woe-Smith, a native Syracusean. Woe-Smith left to study in New York for several years with George Lux, who was an artist at the Ashcan School. From him, she was really inspired by realism, by depicting the nitty-gritty scenes of the city. And when she moved back to Syracuse and she set up her studio in 1932, she had a studio not far from here on East Genesee Street, only about a quarter mile away. And she used the skills that she had developed in the urban environment and turned them on the industry of central New York. So we see these really saturated colors, the major contrast between light and dark, and definitely not shying away from scenes of industry along the canal. And then we'll go back in time again. This is a work by Hamilton showing the Fletcher Furnace Company, which was located in Buffalo, New York. Again, you know, that heavy industry is the sole thing that's being depicted in this work. He's not shying away from it, but at the same time, it is so very beautiful in the contrasts. It's just really a captivating image. The Fletcher Furnace Company produced pig iron from 1863 to 1885. And we just touched on beech nut, but I will return to the beech nut factory because we have such a wonderful wealth of images of it. This one, we do not know the artist, but it was produced around 1920. The beech nut factory actually goes back to 1891. It was originally formed as the Imperial Packing Company, and it was purpose-built along the canal in Canajoharie, allowing easy shipping. Its first product was canned ham. And then, of course, they exploded to a number of other products. In 1899, it was incorporated as the Beech Nut Packing Company, and that was when they really started to diversify with baby food, gum, peanut butter, and all manner of other packaged products. Those expansions of the factory were major sources of wealth for the community, and there was a flourishing of resources and architecture and art in the community of Canajoharie as well, until 2009 when the plant closed and moved to Florida, New York. And we'll go back to the Jeffrey Biggs for a moment, again showing this this factory and this major source of wealth for the area, but all of the optimism that this brought about in around 1940 at the end of the Second World War. And then we also have some fabulous products with work by, unfortunately, unknown artists. On the left, we have the ad for beech nut gum, which is also around 1940, which I think is so fascinating in that it is directly showing the factory scene, but is advertising for gum that is made in the country air. So you get both the factory and the bucolic location at the same time. And then on the right is the beech nut Christmas box from 1937. These were a limited edition product that they did every year for several years. And it would have been filled with an assortment of beech nut products: coffee, cream crackers, cheese wafers, oven baked beans, tomato juice, jelly, peanut butter, gum, mints, anything that you can imagine from the wealth of things that they produced and packaged. And again, this one I find interesting in that they chose canal scenes. In this case, they left out the industry, but it's framed with these classical columns, which of course you're not going to find in Canajoharie so much, but interesting. And then, of course, stoneware. So the stoneware industry at the beginning of the 19th century was really focused in New York City and up the Hudson River and different Hudson River ports. But with the opening of the canal, it expands across the canal to communities all up and down the canal. And this is, of course, ease of transport of the finished pieces, but also of the clay, which was mostly brought in from New Jersey. Many pieces of stoneware depicted stylized birds and flowers and just kind of general things. But some, like the piece in the middle that focuses on a house in Havana, New York, do depict real places on the canal. And we also have pieces in our collection, and I'm sorry I didn't have time to pull more images, but ones that show events that happen in these towns. So an elephant, because the circus happened to come to town. So they're a really interesting story in what was going on along the canal. These are some of the advertising materials for some of the potteries and an order form that you see on the right. I included this not only because it shows the diversity of wares and the way that they're marketing, but they're almost works of art in themselves. The images that they have of the stoneware, and you think about the people that are doing the engravings and then the printings, we have layers and layers and layers of artists once again. So this is the start of a Syracuse ceramic story that I wanted to dive into since we're in Syracuse today. The stoneware jug there you see was produced by the W.H. Farrar Company, which was located in Geddes. Farrar was originally from Vermont, and he opened his pottery here in central New York around 1840 on West Genesee Street. He produced salt glazed stoneware like you see here. By 1850, we know that the company was using 225 tons of clay a year, all being brought in on canal boats, and 500 cords of wood a year, and they employed a staff of 6, which to me seems low for the output that they were doing, but that's where they were. In 1857, Farrar sold the plant to a former employee who moved it to Furnace Street to be closer to the canal, and at that point they began producing molds, produced animals like the spaniel that you see here, and also included the Rockingham glaze, which is what is on the spaniel, the dark brown glaze. These are some images that were actually taken by the New York City Science Services staff, and they were first published in a very early publication of the New York State Museum. At the time, they were studying different raw materials in New York, how those raw materials impacted industry across the state, and they looked at all different kinds of things. So these are a really wonderful glimpse into what it was like in the pottery at that time. In 1868, the company was actually sold to Charles W. Cockenhall, and he created the Empire Pottery Company, which focused on fine tableware. And then in July 1871, the company was expanded. The production had exceeded its capacity. But they did not have enough capital to fund that expansion. So they gathered a group of 16 businessmen from the Syracuse area and formed the Onondaga Pottery Company, where they focused on white earthenware products. And of particular note on the lower left, you see the decorating room where there are a number of women employed. And women were considered to have better fine motor skills, more attention to detail, and they were frequently employed as painters in this type of pottery operation. So from there in 1884, Elmer Walter set up the Boston China Decorating Works right across the street from the Onondaga Pottery Company as a rival. But only 4 years later, his factory burned to the ground, and the Onondaga Pottery Company invited him and all his employees to come work for them and decided to really revolutionize the product that they were putting out. In 1885, James Pass became the new superintendent of the company, and his focus was innovation. Most importantly, they produced the first vitreous china body made in America, which was very shiny and very durable. And it became the gold standard in hotels, on trains, in restaurants across the country. At one point, 70% of the china used on trains in the United States was produced here in Syracuse. They also developed a new way to apply decals under the glaze. So this was much faster than hand painting, more efficient, and also very durable. And you can see examples here of, on the upper right, the clay that was collected by the New York State Museum, as well as on the lower right, the molds that were used for producing the china. And in the center on the bottom, a sample plate. And this is what was shown to potential people that were interested in buying china. They would approve it, and then it would go into production. And very interesting, tying back into the canal in our collection, is a large setting of china produced by Syracuse China that was used on the Inspector 2 on the canal, which was the boat that Roosevelt traveled on as governor. And you can see the New York State seal on those pieces, and the New York State colors, blue and gold. This is an image of the Durhamville Glassworks from the mid-19th century, as well as a window pane and a piece of glass slag that were again collected by the New York State Museum Science Services. And I will say this is one of the things I really love about working in the New York State Museum, is that we get to look at this history and this art and the science that are related to it and talk to our colleagues in the sciences. So Durhamville was located in Oneida County. The glassworks operated from around 1845 to 1900, and they specialized in window panes, which the piece you see on the upper left is part of. But they also expanded to other decorative glassware. And again, another industry on the canal that's also producing really interesting decorative arts. These pieces are from the Lockport Glass Factory, which was operated from 1843 to 1908. The next industry I was kind of thinking about for today, not such a hard industry, but is that of the arts themselves and the artists that were traveling the canal. So we've talked a little bit about different artists who settled along the canal, but there was also a large group of people that traveled and followed the wealth as it flowed up and down the canal. These two pieces were are attributed to Sheldon Peck. He began his career as a portrait painter in Vermont. And in 1828, he moved to central New York and again followed the growing wealth along the canal and the opportunities afforded for artists. Here we see Elizabeth Ann Ferris Preston and Andrews Preston, who lived in Cato. They first settled in Jordan and then Cato, both west of Syracuse, and they were owners of the Cato General Store. So another example of people that were taking advantage of the opportunities afforded by the canal, becoming wealthy, and then being able to support an artist. In addition to this, I think it's also important to note, in terms of Sheldon Peck, ideas were traveling along the canal as well, reform ideas. And Peck himself was active in reform movements, including temperance and free public education. Here we see a scene actually showing an itinerant artist visiting a family and making portraits. This painting is by Charles Bird King, and he studied in New York and then London, and then spent years as an itinerant artist, and including travel on the canal. And he's most known for his later works when he was established in Washington, D.C. in a studio there. But this is a great glimpse into his earlier life. And this work is by Milton William Hopkins, who maybe is a relative. I'm trying to figure that out. But he also worked as an itinerant artist on the canal. He probably instructed other artists. There are references to him potentially providing education in painting. He lived in Albion near Rochester for 13 years. And he actually also became a canal boat captain for a number of years. So he has multiple connections to the canal. We also included this work by Fitz Vaught in our exhibition. And I think he's interesting because when we think of itinerant artists, we really think about the portraits that we just saw. But he was doing the same thing with properties. He was focused on agricultural portraiture and made records of family farms and businesses all up and down the canal. He was trained as a draftsman, so you can really see his intense attention to detail. He uses multiple point perspective to really allow him to show that detail and to record all of the history and just these places. His views were nostalgic. He is capturing a rural way of life that by the time he's making them is very much in decline. But again, an interesting snapshot of these places along the canal. We did touch on the tourism industry, talking about Niagara Falls, but I'm going to have a couple images related to tourism as well. This engraving showing the city of Buffalo was first published in Picturesque America, or The Land We Live In. So this is very much focused on a tourist audience, trying to promote the United States and New York in particular as a wonderful place that you should come and visit. And this, in contrast to the plates that we saw earlier of the Buffalo Canal terminus, this is showing a well-kept, wealthy neighborhood in Buffalo, avoiding the industry of the city and saying, come here and visit. So we talked a little bit about Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls, of course, becomes the ultimate tourism destination. And by the 1850s, it's a popular honeymoon destination. I will note the stoneware jug, or the stoneware crock that you see here, the family story is that this was given as a honeymoon gift, perhaps to a couple who traveled to Niagara Falls. There is a rise of communities around Niagara Falls that are catering towards the tourist crowds, and really thinking of products that can be different types of souvenirs of the time. So we have a couple examples here of souvenirs. On the right is a tile that was actually made in France, and sold through shops here, perhaps to a slightly more well-off patron. On the left, another ceramic plate, and on the upper left, a stevenograph, which is actually a specific type of ribbon that's woven with a photographic image. Often these were sold as bookmarks or kind of novelty postcards, and this one was framed for keepsakes. Native Americans very much took part in the trade and commerce that was going on around the tourism industry in Niagara Falls. Tourists frequently visited the Native American reservations that were in the area, and their handiwork quickly became a popular souvenir. This was really important too, because at the time there were a lot of shifts and changes in Native trade networks, and they realized that tourism was a way to keep themselves afloat and to provide for their communities. Tuscarora women in particular were noted for their beadwork, and we believe that all of the examples that you'll see today are created by Tuscarora women. So you can see purely decorative works like the birch and the canoe, pin cushions, like the one that says from Niagara Falls. Just like our magnets and glasses and anything else we buy today, they all say from Niagara Falls right on them. So perfect gift when you bring them home to your loved ones who didn't come with you. There was a shift in this beadwork from things that were more traditional Native American forms to things that are very much for the European market. So we see things like sewing pockets and wall pockets and pin cushions and things. And these examples are actually from the ethnography collection at the New York State Museum. And the one on the right in particular really shows the intricacy of those layered beadwork details. We mentioned George Barker, of course. He was actually born in Canada, but soon settled on the American side of the falls. And he really catered to two types of tourists. He has his high-end photographs that were sold to people that were wealthier and visiting, and then the stereoscope views, of course, for the general public. And he had a particularly large catalog of stereoscope views, which could be purchased as fairly low budget souvenirs. I wanted to include this as well because it's a little untraditional, and this was part of the Enterprising Waters exhibit. This is a dress that was made by the Celanese Corporation of America specifically for Grace Hudwowski. She worked for the New York State Commerce Department from 1945 to 1961. And in that capacity, she was a publicity writer, a travel promotion supervisor, and she attended trade shows and tourism kinds of things. So this dress is built with scenes of the Erie Canal and encouraging people to come and visit, and that it was still a viable tourism option in the 1940s. And I just love that we have the image of her in this work. If you're familiar with her name, you might also know her. She was the founder of the Adirondack 46ers. So that's the other interesting side of her story. The last thing I want to focus on is the way that artists were interested in documenting the canal and the structures that arose out of the canal. Of course, the Erie Canal prompted the invention and building of new types of structures, and they were interesting to the public. They appeared in the press. People wanted to know more about them. So here we see the grain elevator of the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, which was published in Harper's Weekly in 1877. A new design for steam-powered grain elevator was developed in Buffalo by Joseph Dart in 1842. And this was news that traveled extensively through magazines like Harper's Weekly and in the newspapers as well. We saw this image of by John W. Taylor of Canastota. Again, this is once the barge canal had bypassed this section. So you're seeing the old canal bed, and he's documenting the changes that are happening to the town, the way the businesses are turning themselves around to focus perhaps on the main street as opposed to the old canal bed. And this is one of my favorite works. This is Canal Town Veteran. This is a work by John C. Menahan, who lived most of his life in Rochester. And of course, this type of architecture, this Greek Revival style, is familiar to any of us that travel along the canal to this day. This style was most popular at the height of the canal when wealth was flowing back and forth. People had new money to build homes and were settling along the canal, and business was booming. But now it is ubiquitous along the canal corridor, many times in neglect. So he's showing the sagging building, the lack of paint, just that neglect that you see in many canal towns. And then we come to this building. So we have two images. Oh, I'm sorry, one more. Apologies, I skipped. This work is by Arnie Parker. It shows lock number 2 in Waterford. And you can see the comparison to the roughly contemporaneous photograph of lock number 2. He was interested very much in the structure of the lock, the mechanisms that were used. He depicts them very faithfully. But then when you get to the background, you can see that he very much used artistic license to show the town of Waterford. And then we come to this building. So we have two images of the Waylock building that we're in today. The first on the left is by James Cantwell, who was a Syracuse native. And on the right is by J. Irwin Porter, who was born in Medina. Porter had a career in advertising, but left in 1960 to focus on scenes along the canal, of which we have a very large collection in the New York State Museum. So in 1883, tolls on the canal were abolished and made this building obsolete. In 1905, the upper floor was extended and the scales were removed to make more room for office space. And I presume that's where we are now. Cool. And both of these photos actually show the building after that conversion. So you're seeing it not used in its original purpose. But I think it's very interesting to note that Porter in particular is depicting the building around 1960. So in the 1950s, the plan to build Interstate 81 would have destroyed this building. By 1960, there was still a great deal of uncertainty that road wasn't going to happen, but the building wasn't necessarily saved yet. And this didn't become the Erie Canal Museum until 1962. So I think that's part of why he chose this as one of his scenes along the canal, was documenting this building that he feared would be lost. And finally, I wanted to include a full image of the Johann Mengel's Culver House. And I had a hard time with where to put this because it kind of fit into a lot of different themes. He's showing a Syracuse that is bustling and industrial, but it's also very welcoming. I would like to walk into that scene and enjoy the evening out in downtown Syracuse. So I leave you to think about that, about what his motives were. Culver House was born in Holland. And of course, that is a country that has a really rich painting tradition that is focused on canal scenes. So I think that is probably part of his success in this work. And of course, also he was known for works by moonlight and those contrasts that you see in this painting. With that, I'll leave it to any questions. Yes.
Here's a question for you. The Elwood Museum in the Yesterday of New York has fabulous renderings of probably lithographs of the factories in Amsterdam. And as I studied them, because I didn't know Amsterdam very well, I realized that the buildings were taller than they really were. And it was a way to dramatize how important the carpet industry was with Sanford Bigelow, on and on. But I was fascinated by it. And then I got really lucky when I found my book in one of the records. And it looked very similar to it, but just a little bit different. But it was really fascinating. And they by the way, they do have a really neat collection of, the carpet industry. And then you see it, but anyway, it was fun.
Thank you. Yes.
Look at that artist on the left. It's quite an exalted image of Syracuse. It looks like Lower Manhattan.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
Karen, you mentioned that the Hudson River School didn't call themselves that kind of derogatory. I assume they recognized they were in some sort of movement together, and like, did they have a name for themselves?
No, they weren't particularly in school. They were just a sort of group of artists that were friends that often traveled together. They had no, they didn't study in the same places. They weren't from the same places. Both of South came from England. They really, it just seems as though, once we get past the Civil War and we're moving into very different kinds of attitudes toward landscape in this country, especially landscape, but everything, we see a different look to the past. And it's interesting to see how the Hudson River School goes up and down in popularity. It's really fascinating to see what brings huge prices in the 1990s as opposed to 1960s. But yeah, they didn't really call themselves any more than I mean the Impressionists really didn't call themselves that either. So
Did they recognize that they were of a similar mindset?
I imagine so, because they were friends. I mean, that's the thing, they were friends. Many of them wrote a lot, all wrote about landscape, so, and so did, Bierstadt and, you know, they had friendships in New York City, and then they all traveled, and it's a really interesting group of people who have unfortunately been lumped together. But don't, if you start to look at them fairly, their styles are fascinating. It just seems as though it's convenient to all of that. And the irony to me is so many of them did not. It's still different.
What's that mansion that's north of Poughkeepsie, on the east bank of the Hudson?
Alana,
Hold on.
that's the church's house.
Oh, what?
Yeah. Yeah, and Bierstadt had a house also near there, but it burned down. Cole was on the other side of the river, much more modest house. That's both Alana and the Cole house are open. It's Cole's two houses, so you can visit them.
And Morris's house too.
Right,
Samuel F. B. Morris's house is in Poughkeepsie, and there's
Yeah.
also a museum.
Who's?
and
Samuel F. B. Morris.
and Cropsy's coming down. So they're all, you can track it out.
Just one more on today. This is the first time I went to the Erie Canal. It's incredible. I love it. And as I was looking downstairs with all the images of Syracuse, there was a little description that said, Syracuse was almost like a mini Manhattan. And so the artist was actually trying to dramatize Syracuse as a little bit bigger than it really was, and a little bit more dramatic than it really was, which was fantastic. I love that. So the
Absolutely.
artistic license is really fascinating, you know, with all this stuff that we've talked about today.
Elizabeth, that's the first skyscraper, right?
No,
The one to the right, not the tall building,
yeah,
the one to the right, that's actually the shorter building in there, but it had, what is it? Steel frame structure, so you can see Syracuse's skyscraper in that.
Wow.
It's actually the short one. The state tower building is the tall
Building.
yeah, the.
We have one question in the chat. Now that the exhibition is over, do you know which works are currently on display? And are there any specific galleries we should check out? Definitely the Art Canal.
Yes, the art gallery has them.
and a bunch of them, I don't know what is up where.
I'm not sure.
Because it was a long show and it drew across from institutions across the state, so. I'm not sure what's on view at any of them.
I heard a little bit, you heard how they extend the part of their current exhibit and then run it slightly longer. Oh, so you have to contact the art gallery for more details.
And I know the headline Moonlight over Glen Square is on display in Deutsche.
That's right.
They always have that on.
Yep, and I'm not sure that it's on view in Buffalo, but the Fletcher's furnace image, they have a really great, like extended blog post on their website that you can check out.
You had some pieces from Fenimore,
Mhm.
I believe, and they look very nice personally this month.
Absolutely, absolutely, and some of those pieces might be on view now.
Have a lot of it so far.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.